I remember the sound clearly, a distant hum that grew louder until it cut through the air like a blade. I was sitting in the cockpit of my Messerschmitt, the view of the instrument panel obscured by the glare of the sun streaming through the small canopy. There are things I've learned to count before a fight: the smell of the fuel, the weight of the flight jacket, the mental sequence of checklists we repeat so many times they become a prayer. That day, however, there was a different kind of tension. Something on the radio, a series of intercept reports, and the name that made every face in the squadron turn pale: Mustang. It wasn't just any plane, it was the P-51 Mustang, a fast, elegant, and surprisingly resilient creature. In previous briefings, I had heard numbers and technical terms: range, rate of climb, escort range. I heard about its endurance with external tanks, about how Mustangs could keep up with and escort bomber formations thousands of meters high, denying us the opening we had once exploited. But numbers don't translate what it's like to fly against something that insists on appearing exactly where you least expect it. It was like facing a predator that had learned to predict your moves. That day, the assigned mission was clear: intercept a convoy of escorted bombers. Our objective was simple on paper: break the escort, shoot down as many as possible, force the bombers to abort or suffer enough losses to disrupt the mission. Tactically, we had defined rendezvous points, passing altitudes, and visual signals. But every plan meets a real test as soon as the engines roar and the terrain becomes just a receding line beneath us. I remember the feeling of forming the line. The squadron's cohesion gave me a certain sense of security, until the first tracers began to streak across the sky. These weren't just random shots, they were calculated bursts, short, precise, following patterns that betrayed discipline and training. The metallic sound of the bullets grazing the fuselage of my plane seemed to come from all sides at once. Instinctively, my hand gripped the throttle, and I felt the plane respond. The Messerschmitt always had a quick response, but at that moment it seemed as if physics were working for us. The Mustang's speed reduced the windows of opportunity, and each maneuver required fear and concentration. As I looked out, I tried to assess the enemy formation, some Mustangs rotating, others maintaining lateral cover, and in the center, the glare of the American fuselage reflecting the sun. It was obvious we weren't dealing with inexperienced pilots. Their tactical choices, the coordination between pairs, the fire discipline, everything pointed to something more than a simple patrol. There was something almost clinical in the way they fired, as if each burst was studied to maximize effect and minimize exposure. However, there was also that old sense of camaraderie that overcomes fear. We exchanged quick glances, a signal, a gesture, a brief nod that said, "Hold on tight." I thought of the training days, the rushed takeoffs, the anxiety that precedes each encounter. I thought of home, of those letters that haven't yet been written, and of the wish that, at the end of the day, I could simply land, silence the radio, and place my helmet on the co-pilot's seat as if nothing had happened. This was the entrance, the first shock. The sky, which until then had seemed like a vast stage, closed like a throat. For a moment, I felt that all our training had been merely preparation for a single second, the explosion of adrenaline and metal that would follow. I'll tell you what happened next, the maneuvers, the split-second decisions, and how the hail of bullets transformed that moment into opening captions, but I'll leave the rest for the next part. When you're ready, I'll move on to part 2 and we'll dive into the fight sequence. The first burst of bullets cut through the radio silence like a metallic thunderclap. I barely had time to think. Instinctively I pulled the stick to the left, feeling the Messerschmitt react with the precision of a cornered animal. The sky transformed into a chaos of crackles, luminous trails, and shadows crisscrossing at high speed. The sound was almost physical, bullets ricocheting through the air, the roar of the engine pushed to its limit, and that subtle whistle that only those who have been in aerial combat recognize, the sound of death passing too close. The Mustangs came from above, diving in perfect formation, as if they had rehearsed that attack for weeks. And perhaps they had. The P-51 had an advantage in altitude and speed, and they knew how to use it. When they dove, they gained kinetic energy that we could hardly match without risking the engine. The sound of my Daimler-Benz turbo rose in pitch and pressure as I tried to turn the nose toward the enemy to maintain the firing angle. But they didn't stand still. They made smooth, wide turns, too fast for any complete response. I glanced quickly at the horizon and saw one of my companions being hit. His Messerschmitt exploded in a cloud of black smoke, pieces of metal swirling in the air like burnt leaves. For a second, I wanted to rush over, an almost irrational impulse to help, to understand, but instinct pulled me back. Stay alive. I gritted my teeth in dove, using the sun to my advantage. Below me, the landscape blurred by German fields, rivers, and forests, all silent witnesses to a war now being fought thousands of feet above. I tried to level my flight and align with a Mustang crossing my field of vision. It was coming in an ascending curve, confident, unaware that I was there. I adjusted the display, calculated the deflection, and pulled the trigger. For a brief moment, the machine guns responded with a synchronized roar. I saw the tracer bullets arc and pass dangerously close to the target, some, perhaps, hitting. The Mustang swayed, corrected, and disappeared into the blue. "They're too fast," I heard someone on the radio. The voice sounded tense, but not defeated. "Maintain altitude, avoid tight turns with them." It was the right instruction. We knew, in long, open turns, the Messerschmitt could hold up, but trying to spin alongside a Mustang was suicide. They had wider wings, stability at high speeds, and a much more predictable response in horizontal maneuvers. That's when I realized something that would completely change how I viewed that confrontation. The Mustangs weren't simply attacking, they were protecting something. Below, a group of B-17 bombers was en route, in tight formation, surrounded by an invisible wall of fire and courage. It was for them that the Mustangs were fighting, and it was against them that we were forced to charge. From then on, everything became a matter of choice: try to break through the escort, risking my body and the plane to reach the bombers, or engage the Mustangs and hope to create an opening. No choice was good. No guarantee of return. But at that moment, amidst the hail of bullets, I realized we were fighting something bigger than a machine. We were facing a doctrine, a way of thinking, an enemy that had learned from us and was now applying everything with surgical precision. The sky trembled with smoke and fire. The radio, once full of voices, began to fall silent. Few of us remained, scattered, trying to reorganize a line that no longer existed. It was every man for himself. And I knew, the next dive would be decisive. Either I'd bring down a Mustang, or I'd turn into smoke in the air. Time seemed to slow down. The sound of the roaring engine was no longer just noise, it was the pulse of my own heart. By then, the smoke from the gunfire, the smell of burnt oil, and the metallic taste of the air inside the mass created an almost unreal scene. At 7,000 meters, war had no color or sound, only vibration and instinct. The sun reflected off the wings of the Mustangs, creating flashes that confused the eyes, and it was in these reflections that I tried to find an opening, a moment of weakness. I saw one of them move slightly away from the group, perhaps maneuvering to resume his escort position. It was my opportunity. I positioned the nose of the Messerschmitt slightly below the horizon and let gravity do its work. The speed increased rapidly, the altimeter spinning like a mad clock. I felt my body pressed against the seat, the blood rushing from my head, my vision darkening at the edges, the famous blackout. But before the darkness completely engulfed me, I pulled the control stick, aligned the target, and prepared to fire. The sight of the Mustang grew before me, first a silhouette, then the outline of the wings, and finally, the gleam of polished aluminum. I could see the American markings on the fuselage. It hadn't seen me yet. I adjusted my aim, sensed the exact moment, and pulled the trigger. The response was immediate. The sound of MG-131 machine guns filled the cockpit, a dry, rhythmic noise. Tracers cut through the space between us in orange lines. 2, maybe 3, hit the target. The Mustang shook, lost altitude, and began to emit smoke. Correct. I yelled into the radio, not even knowing if anyone was listening. But the celebration was short-lived. Another Mustang appeared from the right, diving, and before I could react, its bursts of gunfire began to pass close to my wing. I felt the impact. A deep, metallic vibration shot through the plane. The panel lit up with red lights. Control damaged. With each movement of the control stick, the Messerschmitt responded with a delay, as if it were wounded. I knew I couldn't climb. The engine was overheating, and the radiator had probably been hit. So I dove even further, trying to escape the enemy's line of sight. The sound of the wind whistling through the structures was deafening. Behind me, the bullets kept coming, tracing paths of fire through the air. The Mustang wouldn't give up. It hunted me with precision, like a hawk. That's when I made a desperate decision. I drastically reduced the power, feigning a malfunction. The plane slowed down, and the enemy flew right overhead. That was the moment I'd been waiting for. I pulled back on the stick, gained sudden altitude, and fired. The bullets cut through the air in a straight line, hitting the Mustang in the rear fuselage. I saw pieces flying, and the American plane began to spin, spiraling down. For a moment, everything seemed to return to silence. Only the irregular sound of the engine accompanied me. The sky, once full of enemies, now looked like a blue desert. I took a deep breath. My hands trembled. I don't know if from fear or adrenaline. I was still alive, for now. But the battle was far from over. There were other Mustangs in the area, and the radio crackled again with urgent voices: "Formation compromised, retreat south." It was the order no one wanted to hear, but everyone knew what it meant. As I walked away from the combat zone, I looked back one last time. The sky was covered in smoke and debris, the remnants of a battle that seemed to have no winner, only survivors. And I knew, deep down, that this encounter would not be the last. The radio crackled with broken voices, mixed with the hum of the damaged engine. The Messerschmitt swayed with small vibrations that increased with each passing minute, as if the fuselage were about to fall apart. The thin smoke escaping from the side of the engine was a constant reminder that time was against me. Every second flying was a second closer to the engine simply shutting down. The order was clear: retreat. Regroup at the secondary base. But the map in my head said otherwise. Fuel was below the minimum level, the gauge needle was already touching the red zone, and the distance to the nearest base seemed impossible to cover. The reality was simple: either I found an improvised landing field, or I would end up as a fireball in some German forest. I descended to conserve energy. At 2,000 meters, the air was already denser, the engine was cooling down a bit, and the view of the ground gave me a false sense of security. But even from there, I could see what war was doing to the world: destroyed villages, columns of smoke in the distance, and burned fields where wheat had once grown. It was the invisible price we paid for every battle won, and for all the ones lost. On the radio, I could still hear fragments of communications. Some comrades tried to make contact, others shouted coordinates, and there were also those who remained silent. Silence, in war, speaks volumes. It is the sound of those who will never return. Suddenly, I heard something different. A growing noise, coming from the left. I looked quickly, and there it was, a lone P-51 Mustang, probably the same one that had chased me before. It found me. And back then, I was an easy target: slow, smoky, vulnerable. My first impulse was to try to escape. I accelerated, but the engine responded with a metallic groan, almost a plea for mercy. The Mustang was approaching rapidly, its wings tilting slightly, a gesture that could mean defiance, or respect. For a moment, it didn't take off. I stared at that silver silhouette against the blue sky, and wondered if, on the other side, the driver saw in me what I saw in him: a tired man, struggling to get home. But the silent truce lasted only seconds. He dove, and hell broke loose again. Bullets passed inches from the canopy. I made a sharp right turn, feeling the plane creak. The Mustang climbed, repositioned, and came in again. I no longer had any advantage, neither altitude nor power. All that remained was experience. That's when I decided to use the terrain to my advantage. I moved towards an area of low hills and valleys. The Messerschmitt, even damaged, was still agile at low altitudes. The heavier Mustang would have difficulty maneuvering so close to the ground. The strategy was simple: make it get too close and lose control. I descended until I almost touched the treetops. The speedometer needle trembled dangerously near its structural limit. Behind me, the sound of machine guns echoed in short bursts. The Mustang was glued to the track. That's when I pulled the stick sharply upwards, in a risky half-loop. For a second, I lost sight of the horizon, everything spun, the ground and the sky blurred together. When I regained my balance, the enemy had passed right by, unable to follow the maneuver. It was my chance to escape. I reduced power, changed course, and headed toward a clearing that seemed long enough for a forced landing. The plane descended in fits and starts, the smoke now too thick to see clearly. I touched down hard, the landing gear broke immediately, and the Messerschmitt slid across the field until it stopped with a crash. Silence. Only the crack of metal cooling. I unbuckled my seatbelt, opened the canopy, and took a deep breath. The air was heavy, smelling of fuel and burnt earth. I was alive. I could hardly believe it. I looked up at the sky, still hearing the distant echo of enemy engines. It was the end of the combat, and the beginning of another battle, surviving in enemy territory, hoping that rescue would arrive before the enemy found the wreckage. When the engine noise finally faded, the silence became almost deafening. It was strange, after so long surrounded by gunfire, alarms, and the constant roar of the engine, the silence seemed unnatural, heavy, almost menacing. I was alone, wounded only on the inside, surrounded by smoldering wreckage and the acrid smell of spilled fuel. The Messerschmitt lay tilted, one of its wings buried in the soft earth. I descended cautiously, still staggering from the impact. The ground was cold and damp, and the low vegetation trembled in the wind. For a few seconds, I just stared at the plane, unsure whether to thank or curse that machine. It had brought me here, and almost killed me. I touched the fuselage as if saying goodbye to an old friend. The radio had died during landing. Without communication, I was just another lost dot on the map. I estimated I was about 40 kilometers from the base, maybe a little more. The region was rural, dotted with small farms, dirt roads, and some dense forests. At this point in the war, nobody could trust anyone. Frightened civilians, advancing American patrols, and Allied fighter jets circling the sky looking for any suspicious movement. I began walking north, guided only by the sun and my intuition. Each step was accompanied by the distant echo of the battle that still raged elsewhere on the front. The ground was covered with damp leaves and metallic fragments that gleamed in the light, shrapnel from other machines that hadn't been as lucky as I was. As I walked, memories began to overtake me. The faces of my comrades, the muffled laughter during rest periods, the conversations about the end of the war that everyone pretended to believe was near. I remembered Muller, the youngest in the squadron, who always said that flying was the only way to feel free. He had taken off with me that morning. I hadn't seen him since the beginning of the fighting. The hours passed, and fatigue began to weigh on me. My empty stomach and the night chill made everything more difficult. I found shelter in an abandoned barn, its boards creaking at the slightest movement. I lay down on a pile of hay and watched through the cracks in the roof as the sky darkened. There was still smoke on the horizon, the same sky that hours before had been the scene of a hell of fire and metal now seemed too calm, as if mocking us. There, in the silence, I began to understand what it truly meant to be a fighter pilot. It wasn't just about maneuvers, victories, or medals. It was about surviving one day at a time, about dealing with guilt and fear, and about trying to preserve humanity in a world that did everything to rip it away from us. I took out the diary I always carried in my coat pocket. The pages were stained with grease and oil, but they could still receive one more entry. I wrote only one sentence. Today I faced the enemy, but the greatest battle begins now, within myself. I closed the diary and fell asleep, listening to the wind rustling through the cracks in the wood. For the first time in a long time, the sound of silence seemed like a blessing. Dawn arrived with a pale light, filtered through the fog that covered the field like a sheet. I woke to the distant sound of engines, not airplane engines, but truck engines. I stood still, listening. My heart raced. It was impossible to know if they were ours or theirs. At that moment, every noise could mean rescue, or capture. I waited a few minutes until the sound became clearer. They were slow-burning engines, typical of military vehicles. I looked through the crack in the barn and saw the metallic glint of something moving among the trees. I approached carefully, crawling through the hay and shadows. Then I saw the black cross painted on the side, the Luftwaffe cross. My relief was immediate. I jumped up and ran outside, waving the white handkerchief we always carried in case of a forced landing. The truck stopped abruptly, and 2 soldiers jumped out, pointing their weapons before recognizing me. One of them smiled, the other just shook his head. "We thought you had crashed behind enemy lines," the driver said, as he helped me into the back of the truck. We could hardly believe it when we saw the plane smoking in that field. Inside the truck, 2 other pilots were seated, they had also been shot down. One of them, with his arm bandaged, looked at me and asked, "Which squadron are you from?" When I mentioned the unit number, he made a gesture of surprise. "So it was you who held that Mustang in the air? We saw their smoke trail from afar. They said on the radio that one of you had managed to hit one of the enemy fighters." I nodded, without much to say. His face was pale, but his gaze held a mixture of respect and sadness. No one celebrated victories at that stage of the war. Every victory came at a great cost. The journey to the secondary base took hours. We passed destroyed villages, abandoned tanks, and columns of soldiers marching in silence. The air smelled of smoke and burnt metal. As we advanced, I began to realize something I hadn't wanted to admit before: the Luftwaffe was no longer the same. Fuel was scarce, experienced pilots were being replaced by rookies with weeks of training, and the dominance of the skies, which had once been our pride, was now in the hands of the Americans and British. When we finally arrived at the base, the scene was one of desolation. The hangar was destroyed, the runways were patched up, and a heavy silence hung over the mechanics. The few remaining planes looked like ghosts waiting for one last flight. I was taken to the communications officer to give my report. He listened attentively, noting every detail: the number of enemies sighted, the altitude, the engine conditions, the type of formation. When I finished, he paused, looked at me, and said, "You were lucky. Most don't come back to tell the tale." I remained silent. He was right. But there was something else that disturbed me. During the combat, for a moment, when I saw that Mustang hesitate before firing, I realized something I hadn't expected to feel: respect. A silent recognition between enemies who, despite being on opposite sides, shared the same fate, that of being just men trying to survive a war that had already ceased to make sense. Later, alone in the makeshift shelter, I looked up at the sky. No planes were flying that morning. The air seemed too calm. But I knew it was just a lull. The war would call again, as always. 2 days after the forced landing, command ordered us back into the air. The mechanics had patched up the few remaining planes, gluing pieces of metal together as if trying to breathe life into a tired body. The sound of hammers echoed through the hangars like the ticking of a clock that insisted on counting down the time of a lost war. When I received the new assignment, I felt the weight of reality. Our squadron was reduced to less than half its size. The familiar faces were no longer there. Those who had returned with me now occupied beds in a makeshift hospital, and the new pilots, young, nervous, some under 20, wore the uniform as if they didn't yet understand what it meant. We took off at dawn. The sky, a cold blue, seemed too calm, as if it wanted to deceive us. The mission was to intercept another formation of American bombers heading towards Berlin. We knew what that meant: an escort of Mustangs. Lots of Mustangs. During takeoff, the cold wind stung my face, and the still erratic engine vibrated more than I would have liked. Even so, there was a strange sense of peace. After everything I had seen, there was no longer any fear, only a silent acceptance that this could be my last flight. The radio crackled, bringing the familiar voice of our squad leader: "Men, remember, we are not here to win. We are here to resist." Those words kept hammering in my head. Resist. That's what we did, an almost symbolic resistance, a gesture of honor in the face of the inevitable. Minutes later, the enemy appeared. First, distant dots on the horizon, then, perfectly aligned formations. The sun reflected off the silver wings of the Mustangs, and soon, the sky was once again the chaos I knew so well. The difference was that, this time, I didn't feel the panic of the first battle. I knew exactly what to do. Smooth turns, controlled dives, short bursts. Time seemed to flow more slowly, and each decision was made with surgical precision. I shot down a bomber. I saw its engine explode in an orange cloud. For a few seconds, a feeling of victory swept through my chest, but then came the backlash. 2 Mustangs diving on me, fast, merciless. The first one fired, and I felt the impact on my wings. The second tried to cut off my escape route. I made a tight turn, the G-force pressing against the seat. My vision began to darken at the edges, but I maintained my focus. I fired without aiming, purely instinctively. And, to my surprise, I hit it. The Mustang spun, going out of control. For a moment, the sky seemed clear. I took a deep breath and looked around. The radio was silent, my companions scattered. It was then that I realized something that chilled me to the bone. I was alone. No allies in sight. Only smoke and trails of fire dissolving on the horizon. I tried to correct the course, but the engine started to fail again. The vibrations returned, stronger than before. It was as if the plane knew that this would be its last flight as well. I looked at the dashboard, then at the sky. Up there, the Mustangs dominated the space, like absolute masters. They had won. But somehow, I felt no resentment. I felt only a strange serenity. I clutched the diary in my pocket, the same one in which I had written my last sentence. I thought about continuing. War is made by men who learn to fly, and, when they fall, discover that the ground is more human than the sky. The engine finally gave out. I glided until I lost altitude, searching for an open field. I managed to land without serious damage, just the dry sound of the landing gear breaking apart. I left the cockpit and looked at the horizon one last time. The sun was beginning to set, tinging the sky red. It looked like the blood of war being carried away by the wind. I knew that would be my last flight. And somehow, that brought me peace. The following days were a blur of news, contradictory orders, and increasingly long silences on the radio. When Germany's surrender was finally announced, the world seemed to stop, but inside me, everything kept spinning. There were no fireworks or applause, just a profound weariness, the kind of fatigue that comes from carrying more memories than the body can bear. I returned home on a train that seemed made of memories. Each station brought different faces, some dejected, others trying to smile. Soldiers, nurses, refugees, all with the same lost look. We weren't heroes returning from war, we were survivors trying to relearn how to live. When I arrived in the small town where I was born, I found only ruins. My family's house was still standing, but the garden, the trees, the smell of bread coming from the corner bakery, everything had disappeared. The silence was heavier than the roar of the engines I heard in combat. In the following months, I tried to adjust to life without the sound of machine guns. But it was impossible. Sometimes I would wake up in the middle of the night, my body sweating, swearing I had heard the roar of a P-51 flying over the roof. Other times, I would spend hours looking at the sky, trying to find meaning in the passing clouds. I gradually discovered that the war doesn't end when the last shot is fired. It continues to live on within those who have returned. One day, I decided to visit the field where I had made a forced landing. The grass had already reclaimed the wreckage, and time had erased almost all signs of the impact. Only a piece of the rudder, half buried in the earth, still remained. I touched that cold metal and realized that, despite everything, I was still the same man who had once faced a storm of bullets, but now, I no longer needed to fight anyone. Only the memory. It was there that I understood the true meaning of survival. It wasn't about winning. It was about being able to continue, even without answers. It was about waking up, breathing, and moving on. Today, when I look at the sky, I see the same white trails cutting through the clouds. But I no longer think of war. I think of freedom. I think of how the sound of an engine can be, at the same time, the announcement of death and the symbol of life. And that's what I want to record here, in this final account. Because, in the end, a pilot's story isn't about the battles he fought, but about what he does after the silence returns. If you've made it this far, my friend, I want to thank you for flying with me through this journey, for feeling the wind, the fear, the cold, and the fire of the skies during World War II. But our story doesn't end here. In the next video, we'll leave the battlefields and land in a new setting, the farms and ranches that flourished after the war, where former pilots and veterans found a new purpose, tending the land, raising horses, and seeking, amidst the greenery and silence, the peace that the sky denied them. So, if you're not already part of our crew, subscribe to the WW2 Pilots channel, turn on notifications and come with me to discover how the men who faced war learned to live in peace. The sky may have been the battleground, but it is on land that freedom truly takes root.